You ever get invited somewhere and feel deep down that it wasn't meant for you? Not because your name wasn't on the card, it was. Typed, embossed, first and last, like they were making a point, like they wanted you to see that you were finally included. But inclusion isn't the same thing as welcome. I stood outside the church for a good 10 minutes, fingers frozen on the brass handle, dress clinging to my skin like regret. The same church where he got married, the same one where he once said, "Only family belongs here." That was decades ago. Now it was his funeral. And suddenly, I belonged. The invitation came 2 days earlier, hand-delivered, heavy cardstock, the kind you send for a legacy, not a goodbye. I flipped it over 4 times before opening it. No note, no signature, just a time, a place, and a name. His name. And when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't his handwriting. It was hers, his daughter's, the one who always made sure I knew I wasn't really one of them. So why now? Why invite the girl you spent your whole life cutting out of family photos? I didn't come to grieve. I didn't come to forgive. I came because I needed an ending. And when I walked through those wooden doors and saw her face light up, not with grief, but with triumph, I realized this wasn't a funeral, it was a stage, and I just walked into her final performance. But before she claimed the spotlight, let me take you back to the first time I realized I wasn't part of the story. People always assume that growing up in a big house means you had a good childhood. Tall gates, brick driveways, imported rugs that whispered when you walked. But they don't see the silence behind those walls. They don't hear the way chairs scrape when you're not meant to sit at the table. They don't notice the missing names in family scrapbooks. I moved into that house when I was 8. Mom had finally married up, they said. She wore pearls. I wore hand-me-downs that didn't quite fit. He was kind, in a distant sort of way. Paid the bills, nodded at school reports, slipped 20s into the pages of my textbooks like bookmarks for the future. But love? Love never landed in the spaces between us. And then, there was her, the girl who already lived there, the real daughter. She had a room with gold-trimmed curtains and a door that locked from the inside. I had the guest room. No lock, no photos on the wall. Just a closet that smelled like someone else's memories. She'd passed me in the hallway, like I was invisible. Once told me, "You're not really his. You're just something your mom brought along." I believed her, because no matter how hard I tried to make good grades, to stay quiet, to be useful, I was never really in that family. I was tolerated, federal, clothed, but not claimed. Holidays were the worst. She'd hand out presents from under the tree, reading each name like a performance. And when she got to mine, she'd pause just long enough to remind everyone it wasn't really from him. Just a gift on behalf of the household. Even as a kid, I knew what that meant. A house can shelter you, but it can also make you feel homeless. So when the funeral invitation arrived, it didn't feel like I was being called home. It felt like I was being summoned for something I hadn't earned. Or maybe something they were afraid I already had. I walked in 5 minutes before the service started, just late enough not to make a scene, just early enough to be noticed. The room smelled like roses and mahogany. Classic, controlled, expensive, everything he used to be. People turned their heads as I slipped into the back pew. Polite nods, curious stares, and that one familiar glance, cutting through the air like it still owned the room. She saw me, and for a second, just one flicker of a second, her lips curled. Not in grief, not in pain, but in victory. She was dressed in black, of course, tailored silk, diamonds. Subtle enough to look respectful, but loud enough to say she had inherited well. Not a single hair out of place. Like this day was just another appointment. The minister cleared his throat and started the service. Words about legacy, about family, about love. I watched her as the names were read, the titles listed. Doting father, generous husband, mentor, innovator, philanthropist. But there was no mention of me, not in the program, not in the speech, not in the eyes of the people around me. To them, I was either a +1 or a mistake. And honestly, I didn't blame them. That's how I'd always been presented. Still, as I sat there, back straight, hands folded on my lap like I'd been trained to sit invisible, I felt something shift. Because funerals aren't about the dead. Not really. They're about the living, the ones who stay, the ones who write the final version of a person's story. And from the way she stood, soaking up every glance, every whisper, every careful nod from a lawyer or a former colleague, I realized something that hit colder than grief. This wasn't closure. It was performance. A one-woman show. And I'd just been cast as the audience she never thought would show up. But what she didn't realize was that the most dangerous audience is the one who knows the truth and sits in silence just long enough to let the lies build. She walked to the podium like she'd rehearsed it 100 times. Slow, controlled, every heel click echoing through the room like punctuation marks. There were no tears, not even a shaky breath, just that smile, the kind people mistake for poise, when really it's pride wearing grief like a rented dress. She thanked everyone for coming, the board members, the family friends, the people who mattered. She didn't look at me once. Then she began. Some people, she said, are lucky enough to be born into greatness. Others try to attach themselves to it. The room didn't flinch, but I did. Only for a second. Only inside. She kept going. A story about legacy, about bloodlines, about how her father built everything from nothing, and how some people think proximity makes them part of the foundation. I wasn't mentioned by name, but I didn't need to be. Everyone knew. That's the thing about a well-delivered insult. It doesn't need to scream. It just needs to slice deep enough to make you question if you imagined it. She painted herself as the keeper of the flame, the air, the true continuation of the man in the coffin. And me? I was a footnote, a shadow. She ended her speech with a smirk so slight, only someone who'd studied her, like I had, would catch it. To those who were part of his journey, in any capacity, we wish you peace. I almost laughed. Almost. But I kept still, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that peace isn't something you're wished. It's something you earn. And she was about to lose it, because words have weight, especially when they're dressed up as eulogies, but sharp as daggers. And sometimes, the sharpest thing in the room isn't the insult. It's the silence that follows. After the speeches, the room settled into that polite hush people wear at funerals, where no one wants to be the first to breathe too loud. The minister gave a final blessing. A hymn played softly through the speakers, one of those old hymns that sound less like worship and more like obligation. And then came the reading of the will, or what everyone thought would be the reading. It wasn't public. Not yet. But the lawyer stood up anyway, clipboard in hand, to confirm the names of those mentioned. A list. Clean. Simple. No surprises. Except one. Mine wasn't on it. Not on the seating chart for the private estate division. Not on the distribution line for the charitable trust. Not even listed under sentimental items. Just a blank. I looked down the row of polished chairs, each one labeled discreetly with name tags, initials, little gold stickers. Mine was bare. No card, no title, no quiet acknowledgement that I had ever belonged. For a second, I felt 12 again, sitting at the kids' table at Christmas, watching the real family unwrap matching monogrammed gifts, while I held a generic Happy Holidays mug from the corner store. Some ghosts never stop haunting you. They just change rooms. I adjusted my coat. My palms were sweating, not because I wanted anything from him, but because a tiny part of me, the part I'd spent years trying to kill, had still hoped for something. Not money, not property, just proof. Proof that I hadn't imagined the way he looked at me, those rare Sundays when he'd forget himself and ask if I was doing okay. But the chair was empty, the space around me, hollow, and my name? Nowhere. The others smiled politely, offering sympathetic glances, like I was some distant cousin who'd shown up out of guilt. I nodded, kept my face steady, because what they didn't see was that the real story hadn't started yet, and the name that wasn't on the list was about to be the only one that mattered. It was supposed to be over. People were already standing, chairs scraping gently against the marble floor, heels tapping in rhythm with rehearsed sympathy. The lawyer reached for his briefcase, standard black leather, scuffed at the corners from too many years of delivering bad news in polished rooms. He unlatched it, pulled out a folder thicker than expected. I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes, the slight frown as he thumbed through the tabs. Noticed it, paused, but didn't stop. He cleared his throat, tapped the mic like it mattered, and said, "There appears to be an additional document on file. Recent, unprocessed, but dated." His voice wavered, just slightly, and then he began to read. It wasn't a will. It was a letter, handwritten, folded, scanned, attached to a signed revision. 2 weeks before the man was gone. 2 weeks. No one spoke. Even the air seemed to still. To those handling my estate, I have made a change. The years teach us what time alone cannot. And in these final days, I have come to understand legacy is not built by blood. It is shaped by presence, by patience, by the ones who stay quiet, but stay. I felt my breath catch, but I didn't let it show. He continued, "I hereby amend my previous arrangement. I choose to leave the majority of my personal estate, not to the daughter of my name, but to the girl who never asked for anything, and yet never walked away." The room cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but something shifted, hard, eyes turned, chairs stilled, and for once, she wasn't the one holding center stage. A cough broke the silence, then a whisper, then, "This isn't in the public record." The lawyer closed the folder slowly, hands trembling now. And I just sat there, still, composed, because somewhere deep inside, I knew. That wasn't a mistake. That was the truth. Wrapped in paper and dust and ink, waiting for its moment, and it had just arrived, without permission, without apology, just like I had. The folder was closed, the letter read, but the silence, It was louder than anything that came before it. You could feel it in the air, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room and replaced with truth. No one moved, not the family friends, not the distant cousins who came for the wine and networking, not even the minister, who suddenly looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. And her? She stood, not gracefully, not like before. This time, her chair screeched against the tile, a raw, angry sound that didn't belong at a funeral. She didn't look at me. She looked at the lawyer, eyes sharp, voice sharper, like someone trying to cut a hole in reality. That document was never meant to be part of the file. The words landed, heavy. The lawyer blinked, confused. I found it in the primary folder, dated and notarized. I assumed you weren't supposed to read it, she snapped. There it was, that single sentence, the thing that cracked her clean exterior like a dropped glass. People shifted. You could feel the tension uncoil, like a string pulled too tight for too long. She kept going, voice rising with every syllable. He was sick. He didn't know what he was saying. You promised me that wouldn't go in. That last part, that was the nail. Not just for me, not just for the lawyer, but for everyone in that room who'd ever seen her as composed, poised, polished. Now she was exposed, naked beneath the truth. The lawyer, visibly shaken, stepped back, then spoke again, calmer, firmer. What you're describing would be considered obstruction, and if that's true, I have an obligation to report it. Her lips parted, like she had one more lie ready, but it stalled in her throat. The mask slipped, just enough for the room to see what was really underneath all that elegance. Control, desperation, inheritance, wrapped in fear. I stayed seated, still silent, still watching, because when someone tries that hard to erase you, they always leave the mess behind. And when truth finally speaks, it doesn't scream. It just waits for the guilty to out themselves. The moment after a scandal isn't chaos, not right away. It's stillness, sharp, heavy, like the hush before a thunderclap. She stood there, frozen mid-breath, like even she couldn't believe what had just come out of her mouth. Like the lie had slipped, uninvited, from some corner of her pride. The lawyer didn't say another word. Didn't need to. His eyes said enough. So did the way people were now leaning away from her. Like proximity might stain them too. And me? I sat still, hands folded, eyes forward, not smug, not vindicated, just quiet. Because in that moment, I understood something I had never really believed until now. You don't have to fight for truth. You just have to outlast the lies. And the lie had finally run out of room to stand. She tried to recover, of course, cleared her throat, smoothed her dress, tried to thank the guests again for coming, but her voice cracked halfway through, and no one applauded. Not this time, because no one claps for a performance after the curtain falls, and the curtain had fallen. I stood slowly, no rush, no drama, slid my bag over my shoulder and walked toward the exit, past the rows of legacy friends and old money silence. No one stopped me, no one spoke. Even she didn't turn to look, because shame is louder than footsteps. Outside, the sky was gray, not the kind that threatens a storm, but the kind that follows one. Cool, quiet, cleansing. And as I stepped into it, I didn't feel powerful, didn't feel victorious, just clear. Because justice doesn't always come with headlines or handcuffs. Sometimes it's just a room full of people who finally see what they've been pretending not to notice. Sometimes the loudest truth is the one no one dares clap for. A week later, the headlines weren't about the funeral. They were about the freeze, the estate, once a shining symbol of clean legacy and careful planning, was now under formal review. Not by the family, not by the press, but by the courts. Turns out, when you tamper with a notarized revision, when you hide documents, when you accidentally misplace a signature that changes $1 million trust, the law doesn't care how well you dress or how many fundraisers you've hosted. They care about the paper trail. And this trail led straight back to her. The lawyer had submitted the letter, the envelope, and a formal statement. He didn't wait, didn't ask permission, because silence might protect the innocent, but it damns the complicit. The official report didn't name names, but the people who needed to know, they already did. There were whispers, of course, among the elite circles, among family friends who suddenly stopped returning phone calls. Donors paused their checks. Charities pulled back endorsements. Old colleagues requested distance. And her? She vanished from the headlines, not because no one was watching, but because shame, when exposed, doesn't shout. It disappears. Meanwhile, I got a letter. No envelope, just an email. From the lawyer. Straight to the point. The estate is being reevaluated per the final revision. You are, at present, the only named beneficiary listed without dispute. We'll be in contact. That was it. No congratulations. No apologies. Just fact. And honestly, that was more than enough. Because it wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about being erased. And now the ink had dried. The truth was filed. The silence had been entered into public record. I read the email twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed it to feel real. For so long, my existence in that family felt like a shadow, allowed to hover, but never permitted to stay. And now, I was the only name left on the page. No signatures needed, no contest forms filed, just a simple acknowledgement that the truth had survived longer than the performance. People think justice is a courtroom, or a headline, or a moment where the crowd stands and cheers for the underdog. But sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's just knowing that the story they tried to rewrite didn't stick, that the version where you were less than, unworthy, non-blood, never held up under light. I didn't feel proud, or victorious, or even relieved. I felt still, like something inside me had stopped buzzing, some invisible static I'd carried since childhood. There's a strange peace that comes with being seen, not because you fought to be, but because they could no longer ignore you. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving myself real. Even if no one ever said, "I'm sorry." Even if he never said, "I love you," out loud. Even if the last words I ever got from him came signed on legal paper instead of whispered in person. It was still enough, because words don't always need to be spoken to leave a mark. And sometimes the only apology you ever get is the truth finding its way back to you. So I closed the email, didn't forward it, didn't screenshot it. I just sat with it, because this time there was no one left to fight. And when the war ends, you don't always need a medal. Sometimes just surviving means you already won. I waited 3 weeks before I went back, not because I needed time, but because I wanted silence. No lawyers, no family, no one left to pretend they belonged more than I did. The house looked smaller. Isn't it funny how grief and memory make everything seem bigger until you're finally free of it? The driveway was cracked, the lawn overgrown, The grand porch, where no one ever hugged me goodbye, was covered in leaves. Inside, the rooms were empty. Furniture had been taken, photos removed, curtains drawn like the house itself was ashamed. I walked slow, each step echoing like a memory. The study still had the faint scent of cedar and old books. And in the corner, the one thing no one bothered to take, his chair, that heavy leather recliner, the one he sat in every evening, where he read the paper, where he once asked me, without looking up, if I had eaten dinner. That chair had seen everything, heard everything, watched a child grow up from a corner she was never meant to be in. I didn't sit in it, didn't need to. Instead, I placed something on the table beside it. A photo, just a small one, of me and my mother. Back when smiles came easy, tucked into the corner of a worn-out frame that used to hold a family portrait I was never part of. I didn't leave it for him. I left it for the house. So it would remember that someone had stayed, that someone had loved even when love was rationed like sugar in a war. I didn't take the art, didn't touch the antiques, didn't even look in the safe. Because when you've been denied your name for long enough, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away without needing proof. I had mine, in my name, in ink, in legacy. But more than that, in the fact that I could walk through that house, touch nothing, and leave knowing I didn't need to own it to know I never truly left. I used to think closure would come with some grand finale, a confrontation, a courtroom, a check with more zeros than apologies ever spoken. But it didn't. It came in a hallway, in a house no longer full of voices, with dust hanging like old secrets in the light, and a moment, just one, where I stood still and didn't feel small anymore. I didn't cry, didn't feel some magical release. I just exhaled. And that breath, that quiet, steady breath, was the loudest moment of freedom I've ever known. Because for the first time in my life, there was nothing left to prove. No one left to impress. No narrative to chase. No seat at the table to beg for. I wasn't the mistake they tolerated. I wasn't the shadow in family photos. I wasn't the +1 to my own history. I was the story they tried to bury, and the page they never got to rewrite. And that was enough. People talk about legacy like it's money, stocks, real estate, things you can measure in digits and deeds. But I think it's something quieter than that. Legacy is what stays behind, when the lies are gone, and the lights are off, and the furniture's all been moved out. It's the name someone thought to whisper when no one else would. It's the letter that was never supposed to be read. The truth that waited patiently at the bottom of a briefcase until it couldn't be ignored anymore. It's the chair no one sat in, but remembered everything. And sometimes it's the person who leaves with nothing in their hands, but everything they were owed in the silence that follows. So no, I didn't take the house, or the inheritance, or the spotlight. I left those for the ones still trying to fill something inside them with things outside them. I took the truth that I belonged, even when they said I didn't. The truth that legacy doesn't come from blood. It comes from staying, from loving in the quiet, from enduring in the dark. And if that's not worth inheriting, I don't know what is. If this story sat with you, if it reminded you of a room you were never welcomed in, a truth you carried alone, a silence you turned into strength, then leave a comment below. Not for the algorithm, but because your voice might be the one someone else needs to read tonight. Like this video. If you've ever had to walk away without applause and still found your peace. And subscribe if you're drawn to stories that don't shout for attention, but whisper something deeper. Here, we tell stories that linger, stories about quiet revenge, quiet healing, and the kind of justice that doesn't make the news, but rewrites your life. Thanks for being here. See you in the next one.